Thank you all, and welcome to everybody, both in this room and in the other rooms, which I understand are filled to capacity. Welcome back for those of you who were here last night or during today. As you know, it's been an extraordinary, interesting, rich, multidisciplinary, multi-adjectival experience so far. And I think tonight's conversation is going to be equally fascinating, and as you can tell, they're already comfortably at it, which is very much in our style. It is my pleasure to now introduce Professor Peggy Deemer, who will in turn introduce this evening's conversation with Professor Jacques Rancière. Peggy Deemer is a professor of architecture at Yale University. She is a principal in the firm of Deemer Architects, and before that, Deemer and Philip Architects. She received a Bachelor of Architecture from the Cooper Union and a PhD from Princeton University. The work of her firms has appeared in Dwell, The New York Times, Architectural Record, and House and Garden, among many other publications. And articles by Professor Deemer have appeared in Assemblage, Praxis, Log, Perspecta, and the Harvard Design Magazine, among many, many, many publications, journals, and anthologies. She is the editor of The Millennium House, Architecture and Capitalism, 1845 to the Present, and The Architect as Worker, Immaterial Labor, the Creative Class, and the Politics of Design. She is the co-editor of Building in the Future, Recasting Architectural Labor, and Rereading Perspecta. Professor Deemer is the founding member of the Architecture Lobby, a group addressing architecture's historic lack of labor consciousness and advocating for the value of architectural design and labor. Their voice has been, in my opinion, most welcome, timely, and necessary. Her current research explores the relationship between subjectivity, design, and labor in the current economy. Peggy, welcome.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. It is with great pleasure that I will be introducing the interlocutors for tonight's evening. Mark Gage, Associate Professor and Assistant Dean here at the School of Architecture, was introduced last night by Dean Burke, and I won't repeat that very, very impressive bio, but I do want to, however, say how much we all really appreciate the organization of this fabulous event. Our new honored guest tonight is Jacques Rancière. Jacques Rancière is professor of philosophy at the European Graduate School, professor emeritus at the Université Paris 8, and one of the most influential philosophers of our time, especially for those of us addressing the question of the intersection between aesthetics and politics, and more particularly still, the intersection between these two, aesthetics and politics and education. One of the things that I hope we're attuned to is that this is not just a body of knowledge that in some way characterizes our speaker tonight, but is something that has implications for what we are experiencing here now because we are all performing education. For Rancière, true education must be emancipatory, an objective that demands equality not as an end, but as a point of departure. Rancière was educated at the École Normale Supérieure, where he was a student of Louis Althusser. With his professor and other students of Althusser, Rancière composed and published the seminal Reading Capital. Over the next few years, like many of Althusser's students, Rancière was an active member of the Union des étudiants communistes and constituted the famous Cercle d'Hommes, out of which came the now canonical Carrière Marxiste-Léniniste and the Carrière pour Analyse. In 1974, after the break with Althusser, Rancière published Althusser's lesson and co-founded the journal Révolte Logique. Since then, Rancière has published numerous books, including, and this is a highly, highly edited list, The Knights of Labor, The Worker's Dream in 19th Century France, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, 5 Lessons in Intellectual Emancipation, the names of history on the poetics of knowledge, the politics of aesthetics, the distribution of the sensible, the philosopher and his poor, the aesthetic unconscious, the emancipated spectator, mute speech, literature, critical theory, and politics, and aesthesis, scenes from the aesthetic regime of art, and finally, bel état, the time after. The work of Jacques Rancière, like most European philosophers, psychoanalysts, sociologists, and political theorists of the time, must be completely understood in the context of French resistance in May 1968. A resistance that was started by the students, was joined by the workers, but very much was organized around and with the issues of the university at that time. 1968 became the occasion for him to formulate his position on emancipation, one distinct from Althusser. Althusser, in essence, said that the entirety of the contested French academic situation ultimately rested in the, quote, absolute condition of an inequality between a knowledge and a non-knowledge, unquote. That the function of teaching is to transmit a determinate knowledge to subjects who lack it, and that this knowledge, this is Althusser again, relies on the absolute distinction between ideology and science. Rancière argued that Althusser's assumption of inequality amounted to a tautology, which is to say, if you start out with a presupposition of inequality, you're going to end up with inequality, and that Althusser's dichotomy between science and ideology is analogous to Marx's between those who own the means of production and those who are dispossessed. Throughout his work on pedagogy, Rancière has and had placed the entire idea of philosophy as a judge in question for the simple reason that it is constituted on the division of mental and manual labor. And it therefore cannot rightly assume the authority it had traditionally been granted. In other words, philosophy itself assumes the Althusserian tautology. Rancière's break from Althusser spawned a decade-long study of archives chronicling the experiences, thoughts, and voices of early 19th century workers. Within these archives, Rancière found those who had begun to emancipate themselves by the apparently single act of claiming for themselves what previously belonged to the upper classes, namely the right to think and an equality of intelligence. In other words, these workers assumed an existence outside their material condition. According to Rancière, debates among the various theoretical positions on education, equality, ideology, and state apparati miss the point unless they begin from the premise and practice of an equality of intelligence. His thesis is that equality must be assumed as a point of departure and, again, not as a destination. The essential axiom of equality is a starting point, and the structural considerations that follow form the kernel of his thoughts on politics and aesthetics. The 19th century workers, as I'm sure you're probably all familiar with from his works, sought out the proletarian poets and artists who were able to articulate their longings to move beyond the unyielding predetermination of their own worker longings. Aesthetics is the prior condition allowing for an assumption of equality, which, according to Rancière, have only one true practice, the community of equals. More recently, Rancière has written on the topic of human rights, and specifically the role of international human rights organization in asserting the authority to determine which groups of people, again, the problem of the masses, justify human rights interventions. Here, too, the aesthetic dimension acts as a marker defining subjectivity. It is this with this foundational faith in aesthetics that makes Jacques Rancière so central to this symposium. Please join me now in welcoming him to the conversation that we're about to hear.
So the framework is we're going to have a discussion and we'll leave plenty of time for questions, so I don't monopolize Jacques' time here, but we were speaking earlier and I understand it's your first time speaking in an architecture school. So welcome.
Thank you.
I wore a tie with French colors to put you at ease, so you're relaxed. And, is the... Okay, so first of all, I just have to acknowledge that it's a kind of experiment, and the focus of this symposium was to try to elicit new ideas, not necessarily rehearse old ones or validate existing ones. And so we're going from French continental philosophy into architectural theory into architecture, and as such, we're kind of bringing together different intelligences. And I have to admit, when I was preparing for this for the last several months, I kept asking myself, what are you doing putting yourself on a stage with Jacques Rancière? There's an asymmetry, to quote Elaine Scarry's talk from yesterday. And then I just realized I was reading the work of Rancière, and one of the things he says is that there is not a hierarchy of intelligences, that all intelligences are equal, which was the reason I thought it might be okay to do this. But in that sense, we're not looking for the answer to aesthetics, politics, architecture, and art in one evening. I think Albena may be disappointed because she's not going to be able to take anything that can be immediately useful to scholarship. But I think of this less as having a big bonfire that you're going to warm yourself around, and more looking for little embers that you might take home and encourage to grow into something. So in that sense, we're having a conversation looking for opportunities and openings where, like Timothy Morton said, worlds come together. Or Elaine says, where beauty opens a door into another dimension, an opening into another dimension. So we're looking for those points of contact. I wanted to mention that I actually just wanted to start and talk about the kind of scope of aesthetics. And one of the things that I had noticed, I put together, compiled and edited a book on aesthetic theory in 2009. And one of the things I noticed was that one of the things that authors tend to do and philosophers tend to do is kind of establish the distance with which what aesthetics operates. So Kant has a certain idea about disinterestedness, that you need a certain distance from an object in order to judge it aesthetically, that you can't judge a plate of food as being beautiful if you're hungry, that you need that kind of distance. And Burke and Aristotle talk about the need to be situated so that you see the entirety of a thing, that you can't be too close to a thing for it to be judged aesthetically. Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater really defined the movement of aestheticism, which was separating art from the marketplace and from industrial influences, so that it was this protected little regime of no contact and no distance to everything. And I think that largely when we talk about aesthetics today, at least in architecture, people think of it in those aestheticism terms, that what would you do, what do appearances have to do with architecture? What does aesthetics have to do with architecture? It's seen as a frivolous kind of afterthought that's not really attached to the real meat of the problem. The reason I think there's architects developing an interest in Rancière's work, including Michael Young and Keller, myself, and a number of other people, many in this room, is that what he did seems to be a massive expansion of the concept of the aesthetics to include things like politics. And it becomes conflated with the discourse of art in this really interesting and deep and complex way. So I wanted to start out with the kind of defining question of, if we're not going to define aesthetics as a discipline on its own or as a particular theory of art, can you kind of give us a big picture of the scope of your idea of the aesthetic today?
Okay, but first, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Peggy Beamer for introducing me, and thank you to this school and to all of you. Well, I will speak. You certainly know, but speaking about equality or inequality, you know that I'm absolutely incompetent in architecture. So in a way, I would say, in the bad position. I'm not at all.
I feel the same way, so we share that.
Okay,
That's
so
good.
so there is a way of certain form of equalization, perhaps, I don't know. But basically, to speak about what aesthetics may mean today, well, I must really remember, that for me, aesthetics is not, the philosophy of art, the theory of art, the appreciation of art, and so on, and that, and so not at all some kind of attitude of distance, or if there is an attitude of distance, we must try to understand what distance with what, distance from what, But basically, what I must say that for me, well, my understanding of what the aesthetic means is based on two facts. First, let us say what is for me the ground meaning of the aesthetic. The aesthetic, I think originally has no reference to art as such, because aesthetic, doesn't mean what is, related, what is related to art, what concerns art, but what concerns sensible experience. And sensible experience doesn't only mean, sensuous experience, but the experience of a common world. And so the aesthetic problem in general, is not at all about beauty, it's about the experience of a common world, and who is able, to share this experience, That's why, for me, well, politics is aesthetic before art, before art in a way, because it is in politics that the aesthetic question, was raised, for the first time, because precisely the question is, what kind of common world aesthetic politics constitutes, and who can share, who can take part in this world, and we all know, of course, that precisely, the question is who can be a political subject, well, relatively to his sensible capacity, If you remember, Plato says, that of course workers cannot do politics because because they have no time, because they must stay in their workplace, and it is clear, that this time that they have or that they have not, is in fact both a kind of material and a symbolical position. It's not that they really lack time. It is that it is their definition to be those who have no time, and so we all know that for me the question of politics is really the question of demonstration of capacity. Politics really begins when those who supposedly have no time, to do politics, show that they have time, take the time that they have not. Right? What is for me very important, in the idea of the aesthetic and of the aesthetic conflict, is always this thing, doing what you cannot do, implementing a capacity which is denied to you. It is the same thing, with the old, Aristotelian opposition, which is supposed to ground, politics, the opposition between those who have only the voice, to express pain or joy, and those who have the speech, which allows to make arguments, to discuss, etc. And so basically, which is for me the first level, of understanding, what the aesthetic means. The aesthetic is about the sharing of a common world. This is the first point. Now we all know that at the same time, there is a kind of historical, determination of aesthetics, and that the adjective, and that aesthetic at a certain point, so with Kant, so means, a relation to a specific experience, which is the experience of the beautiful, And because of the beautiful, what is interesting, I think, is that with the emergence of aesthetics, is in fact, exactly at the moment as the emergence of art as such. We know that, before aesthetics, art did not exist as a sphere of experience, Art meant, skill, meant a know-how, and, in the old tradition, there was only, a kind of exception. There were fine arts, and fine arts were art precisely, which were not, of course, part of the, of the technical world, but that were destined, or were techniques, but techniques destined to the pleasure of a certain category of people. namely men of taste, and we must think, if you want to think what was done by Kant, even with the idea of disinterestedness, it's not at all, instituting a separation, but in a way, suppressing a separation. Because when there was, in the 18th century, Voltaire said, that a man of taste has not the same senses, as an ordinary man, So there was this division, kind of, at the same time, physical and symbolical division. And what Kant did, in a way, was to institute, the aesthetic judgment as the taste of those who have no taste, as a kind of universal capacity. And this is why, aesthetic, never define some kind of distance, but on the other, really, opposite meaning, it defines something that, art is doing more than the production of artworks, that art concerns human experience in general and implements a human capacity in general, And I think this is very important, and this is why, there could be this kind of strong link, between political revolution and aesthetic revolution, because precisely, the idea of the aesthetic revolution was an idea of kind of implementation of equality, implementation of this equal capacity.
Let me ask I just want to jump in. One of the things you said is, I think one of the lines that most stuck with me is you said social revolution is the daughter of aesthetic revolution.
Yes, I said. I said it, because what was it? yes, that's true. But
Will you give a specific example?
Right.
I want to read a quote from one of your books where you talk about the specific example, that I think is really illustrative, especially for the audience. But he writes, or I can't remember if this was a speech or you had written it, but you said, the laborer stops his arms in order to let his eyes take possession of the place. His disinterested look means a disjunction between the activity of the hands and the activity of the eyes. We can call it aesthetic experience. An aesthetic experience is not the experience of an aesthete enjoying art for art's sake. Quite the contrary. It is the redistribution of the sensible, a disassociation of the body of the Platonic artisan whose eyes are supposed to focus only on the work of the arms. It is a way of taking time he does not have. This is what emancipation first means, an exercise of equality that is an experience of dissociation of the body, space, and time of work. So in that sense, the aesthetic for you is, in this particular example, is creating an opening or a small tear in the distribution of the sensible which this worker is intended to be existing within.
Yes, no, because, the hierarchical distribution of the sensible as it, that when you are a worker, or this means that you have the hands, you have the eyes, you have the ears, you have all the senses, of the worker, and also, of course, the mind of the worker, And so what is important, what I found important when I was working, on the about 19th century, workers' emancipation, was precisely the aesthetic moment in emancipation. The aesthetic moment, which is precisely a moment of dissociation. So not only saying, that workers are men, like any of but demonstrating a capacity which is a capacity precisely to disinterested judgment, And I try, and of course when I wrote, there was of course a famous, book by Bourdieu on distinction, so critic of Kant, saying, look, Kant wants to make this distinction, between the taste of the ordinary man, just caring, for wine, and saying wine is pleasant, or I like this wine, okay, but no, and the experience, of the estate. No, I thought it was absolutely the contrary, but really, inventing a kind of aesthetic dimension in one's existence, was part really of workers' emancipation, and really, this is my basic. First, this is my basic idea, about the aesthetic. But in a way, the aesthetic is political before being artistic, in a way, And but art, to operate, aesthetically, has to produce a very different effect, of the effect of a technique producing an effect or producing the pleasure, of a class of men or women of taste, etc., etc.
So there's that paradox between aesthetics being an egalitarian pursuit versus one that established hierarchies. And historically, it was defined as something which established hierarchies. And I think one of the things that I feel when I read your work is that it's like the ground is dropping out from under us, like a kind of, you say, inequality can only lead to inequality, but there is no path from inequality to equality. But equality is an absolute assumption. And that's a very strong claim, especially when you're talking about aesthetics as being the tool to manifest that. But I wanted to ask about if the relationship between politics and aesthetics is a core feature of your work, and you've talked about the politics of aesthetics and the aesthetics of politics. I wonder, in this redefined frame of the aesthetic, what would activism mean within that framework?
Yes, I think it's interesting because while there is this idea of the aesthetic art contemplation, and oppose, to activity, to activity, and of course there is this idea that aesthetic disinterestedness, free play of the faculties in Kant, etc., etc. While this means, of course, the opposite of the action, which is supposed to transform the world. So, but I think to think about the relation between aesthetic and activism, we must think about action itself, because the first point, for me, is that the aesthetic doesn't mean kind of distant from action, but a kind of inner splitting of action, and this is what is, I think, clearly, announced by Kant, that the effect, meaning the feeling of the beautiful, is not the effect of art. So what is very strong, is aesthetic experience, but aesthetic experience is not the product of a technique, defining its ends, and programming its ends. That's the first point, And second, about action itself, while there is always this kind of call to action, etc. But this kind of suspicion about Kant's free play or Schiller's play, But what does this mean, this free play or this play, It means the suppression, of the opposition of an intellectual power and the sensuous power. It means the suppression of the opposition, between an active power and a passive power. So what is at the core of the aesthetic effect is the suppression of the very opposition between active men and passive men. And the opposition between active men and passive men, people easily forget it, but it was deeply anchored, in the hierarchical tradition.
That was your break with. That was your break with Althusser, the kind of idea of the elite scholar leading the ignorant out of their suffering.
Yes, but it's not only, the elite, against the ignorant, Well, the active men were supposed to be men who live in the universe of ends, when you choose ends, or even, you can really act only for the sake of acting, of deploying, your capacity, And there was this strong opposition between active men and passive men. Passive men were not people doing nothing. No, they were the workers, But they were passive, because their activity was supposed to be only, in the realm of immediate needs and of their satisfaction, And so really, I think what is important in the aesthetic activism, is, that the core of aesthetic activism is this kind of strange, conjunctions of activity and inactivity, And in a way, I think
I was actually going to ask about that, because one of the things you do is you've written about dance and cinema not as the apotheosis of movement, but sometimes it's inhibition. That I wanted to ask about scaling that idea up to an urban scale to get into maybe kind of a little spatial discussion. That one of the things, at least in terms of the urban and the city relative to philosophy, is the situationists had the dérivé, where you misuse the city in a particular way. Some of the things you've discussed are not taking urban action, but inhibiting it as an act of politics. So you've referenced the Istanbul Standing Man, or it could have been the Beijing Tank Man, or Occupy Wall Street, that there's a kind of political power in the misuse of what the regime declares an urban space to be in terms of the distribution of the sensible. But I guess the question, especially for people who design, is the political action always the misuse of something that exists? Or can those ideas be inherent in the process of the design? Is the political action always come after the thing already exists? Or can a political action or intent exist within the process of its creation?
Well, it's a very question. Well, it's a big question. Of course, yes. Let us say. Well, we can say if we think in terms of space, Well, I think that the basic, or in fact the kind of exemplary, political action, is the barricade, because barricade is blocking the streets, and blocking the streets. So the barricade, the 19th century barricade, Well, it is not a useful military from military point of view. From military point of view, all strategists said, well, it was a mistake, because if you block the street, okay, the government. So this is a wall, against the government and against the army, but it's also a barrier, that prevents you, to go forward, to move, But well, the barricade is a kind of occupation, of the street, which is at the same time is a constitution of an over people. So kind of negation of the separation of space. In fact, blocking the street, and it was still the same. It was the same with the Occupy movements, and so on. In a way, blocking the streets, it means in a pacific way, really subverting the normal use of a street. Normal use of a street is circulation, and what was important, was the decision, of staying instead of walking, And it's interesting because this kind of subversion is also a subversion of the normal way of doing politics. Normally, doing politics, this means, for instance, making a protest in the streets, And so there is kind of, I would say, a kind of relation between, the normality of the urban space and a certain normalization of political protest. And there is this moment, when being immobile, becomes a performance. And what is interesting in the case of the standing man, is that he's a performer, but his performance, consists in doing nothing, and the performance precisely produces this effect of disorientation. But the police doesn't know what to do, he does nothing. He does nothing. So there is no reason, to arrest him. But and so there is a kind of vacillation, of the police use of state. Well, okay, but what I think interesting, about architecture is and the possibility, you know, of the design, you know, being from the very beginning, you know, a kind of subversion of the urban space, you know. Well, is that in a way, you know, in a way there is kind of opposition between two ways of thinking space, you know, because I think I'm struck, you know, when I look from the outside, I'm struck by this kind of obsession of so many architects to to mobilize, you know, to mobilize the idea that architecture must no more, you know, do solid things and block the space, but it must make, you know, the space mobile, and it's quite fascinating. I think while I was looking at those projects that were made for the Biennale of Architecture, you know, the projects, you know, for Detroit, you know, yeah. And I was quite struck, you know, by you know, this kind of obsession, you know, with a building, you know, the Old Post, you know, and then they say the Old Post is a barrier, you know, separating the city from the river, you know, and we must go across, you know, and there are so many projects, you know, that are very strange projects, also having some kind of spiraling, you know, buildings, so like parkings, you know, with the idea that this spiraling building, you know, will engender new spaces, you know, and then there's all sorts, you know, of cultural amenities, but also create some kind of movement, you know. And there is also I think another project with a lot of pavilions, of pergolas, and so on, you know, so as to create a kind of indiscernibility of the inside and the outside, you know, with the idea that people must move, you know. I was struck also, you know, by now this interest, you know, of architects for senior residencies, you know, yeah. With the idea that that the senior must not relax, you know, but it must be activated, you know. Okay, this is to say, but I think that there is today this kind of contradiction. There was a time, I think, where architecture was a way, I think architecture has always been in a way of clearing the space, of clearing the streets, and of course it was the first, you know, with urbanization, you know, of course, urbanization against, you know, street war, you know, but and of course, but more widely, you know, I think, all architectural utopias or architectural projects were projects of streets that cannot be blocked, you know, and it's of course there is this famous example, you know, of Le Corbusier, but also, you know, if precisely with situationists, you know, there were also the projects of Constant, and also this was a kind of project, you know, nothing can block, you know, nothing can block. I think there is this for me this is an interesting, you know. Opposition.
Is that utopian strategy just a speculative redistribution of the sensible?
Well, I think there is a strong architectural utopia, you know, of really, you know, of creating a space of equality, you know, by creating a space of mobility, a space with no barriers, you know, and I think it comes again today. When I was struck, you know, because I had to read, you know, what to prepare a little this discussion, you know. So a lot of texts, you know, of architects about architecture today, you know, and I was struck by this kind of catchy concept of porosity. Porosity. So, I think, and the curator, you know, of the exhibition at the Biennale, you know, had some strange remarks, you know, saying that a city with porous walls, you know, is a city that promotes equality.
Well, I think that comes from one of the. We had talked this summer, and you had looked at Michael Hayes' book because we were talking about architecture's critical history, and I think that porosity in architecture comes from really the Frankfurt School, the idea that the architect's job is to reveal the inequalities or reveal the social problems by this type of porosity, by creating kind of openings where people see problems. And you've been very critical of the Frankfurt School and very critical of that idea of raising awareness, that raising awareness isn't a form of action, it's just raising of awareness, it doesn't require action. And I think architecture largely is still modeled on being socially active in terms of raising awareness of a problem, which I think might be a lot of what you've seen. And I think that's one of the things that this particular symposium is interested in confronting, this history of architecture showing the problem, of showing poverty, of showing, as opposed to having another mechanism. And one of the things I had read in your book that's very coincident to some of the things that we're talking about, particularly Michael Young, is the idea of estrangement. And you have this beautiful phrase where you talk about estrangement as the subtraction of meaning, the giving back of innocence to the capacity of seeing, which is a very different thing than a critical intervention. It's not revealing a problem that you see, it's revealing meaning, which allows you to rewrite some new equation or some new distribution of the sensible. So I wondered what role estrangement might play in your idea of reconfiguring those distributions of the sensible.
Well, I think, basically, you know, the restriction of the sensible, it means, you know, when an art does always something, you know, else, you know, than its proper business, you know, and in a way, emancipation also means, you know, that you are not doing only your own business, but also that the aesthetic efficiency is not the same as the artistic efficiency in a way, you know. The aesthetic efficiency means that you don't exactly know, you know, what will be the effect, you know, of what you are doing. And, okay, so architecture, you know, had always been at the same time, you know, of course, while making buildings and planning towns, etc. But also, you know, making all kind of projects of you know, of kind of fancy architecture, like for instance, Lissitzky's prawns, you know, or if you look even the Tatlin's Tribune, things like that, you know, which really is creating not buildings but symbols of the new life, you know. Well, I've always been fascinating, you know, by the role of the oblique line, you know, in Soviet, you know, architecture, you know, of the very beginning of the revolution, as if it was a matter of creating a kind of space which is no more hierarchical space, you know. There is this kind of arrow, you know, towards the sky, towards the future, you know. So, which mean that people are equal because they are inhabiting the future, you know, and no more inhabiting, you know, the present of oppression or the present of struggle. Well, this means that architecture has always taken up the idea of being a kind of instrument for a reform of perception. You know, so that architecture is supposed not only, you know, to construct units for inhabiting, but really constructing new senses of seeing, walking, acting, you know, feeling, etc. And what is interesting with estrangement, and in a way this is what dissensus means, but what is interesting with estrangement is that at the very beginning, you know, estrangement was defined by Shklovsky, you know, as the proper operation of art, really freeing the object from all the mechanisms, you know, automatism of perception. So estrangement, it meant at the very beginning, well, saying the thing with no interpretation, you know. And critical art, you know, critical art or critical turn, you know, wanted precisely to change the very meaning of estrangement, you know, so that, you know, estrangement means was something to be interpreted, you know. So it could be interpreted, you know, in the Brecht in a way, you know, see if there is something strange, you know, this means that there is something wrong, you know, or that there is something wrong interpretation, you know, and this strangeness is supposed, so to bring about awareness and to bring about energy, for fighting, Well, in the case of the Frankfurt School, well, this function of revelation at the same time is more or less disconnected, in fact, from the idea of giving energy, for action. It becomes really kind of position of distance, So no more, no more, directed towards action, but rather towards the position of distance, and which is always with this idea that but the strange thing is a kind of revelator, but what it reveals, is the inhumanity of the system. It's the harmony. It is the violence, the underpinning harmony, and so on. And this is and of course, architect. It is something which is easy, I would say to put, in the form of fiction, of theater, of literature, Well, in architecture, it's quite difficult. What does it mean exactly, to reveal something by the way of architecture, And in a and in a way, what is very, very strange, for instance, with some kind of critical architecture, of course, like the famous blur, in Diller and Scofidio, is that in a sense, it reveals that there is nothing nothing to reveal, and so you are expecting something, and there will be nothing, and the fact that there is nothing is a critic of the fact that you are expecting something,
But that doesn't institute any change. That's just I don't think
that it institute any change, but what is interesting, is that in this way, architecture becomes a kind of critic of itself. So I don't build anything. This is the first aspect of the critic. I don't make anything. If I don't build, or I build a thing which is nothing, which is just bubble, just water. And there is this famous comment, by Charles Renfrew saying, you go to the cafeteria and you can drink the monument because the monument is just water, etc., etc. But in the end, it's very difficult, to think that something is. Well, it's really revealed like this. I think, it's difficult. It's difficult, to reveal something by the ways of architecture, by the ways of design, And in a way, I think that this function of revelation was rather a kind of for me, I see it from the outside, a kind of endless refutation of so-called functionalism, as if constructing non-functional things, was a critic of self-critic of architecture, as if in fact, the aesthetic project of architecture could be really, just epitomized, in the idea of function, because modernity is not simply about function, about the relation between form and function. Modernity is a kind of much wider project.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about when we were putting this together is the way you talk about the experience of spaces, walking, you said walking, standing, sitting, looking, seeing. I was actually thinking of the audience, and the architect of this building is Paul Rudolph, who designed this in maybe around 1960 would probably be this room. And that was 50 years ago, and he's determined where you enter, where you turn left, where you go down, where you sit. 50 years after he designed it, he's telling these bodies how their posture should behave. That there's an incredible amount of power in that level of control over people's actions. But I think a frustrating thing for architects is that seems like an incredibly political power, but architects have come up with really no way to harness it. And modernism had a lot of the ambitions towards equality that you discuss, but was really adopted for now a kind of luxury class. It didn't produce the equality that it sought to, and I think that may have something to do with that functionalism you talk about.
Well, I think it's not so clear. It's not so clear because first functionalism is an ambiguous term, because in a way also form follows function, means that architecture, is not destined, to make beautiful things, for the pleasure of aesthetics, but is destined to serve life, And it is interesting if you think precisely of Ruskin, and Ruskin, you can say, well, it is yes, aestheticism, etc. But at the same time, in a way, Ruskin endorses, the principle, the principle that the dignity of architecture, is to be defined by the sense of life. And of course, the question is how do you define life, and the extension of your idea of life. But
that's actually one way you defined architecture. You said you put it in the past tense, which I thought was interesting, but it was supposed to build not only buildings, but a new way of inhabiting a new way of life. That it wasn't to reveal the problems of this particular world, but set the format for the world that you want.
Yes, certainly. Well, and I think that the actual idea of critical architecture, follows, the failure, of the project of an architecture reshaping the forms of life and instituting some form of equality. Because I think that really the core problem with architecture is not form follows function, but the idea that use follows design, and use follows design, and in a way, for instance, the situationist derive, was a critique precisely of the principle that form follows that use follows design, and the point, it's that you add, in the history of architecture, forms of architecture and urban planning, but we are totally opposed, to Le Corbusier, and that produced some disastrous effects, Well, for instance, we have the famous, example in France, of La Grande Borne, so near Paris, and it was really supposed to be something like the anti-Le Corbusier, way of dealing with architecture. So no big buildings, no straight lines, small buildings with curved lines and many colors, and the different kinds of units, and a vast green in the middle, and well, now it is the worst neighborhood in France, It is the worst neighborhood in France, not because it is the fault of the architect's utopia, but at the same time there was this idea that, well, the use is can be determined, by the design. Well, the problem I think with architecture and equality is that there was a kind of double bind, in a way, there was this architectural dream, to promote equality through design and through building, and well, the question is that equality cannot be a product. That is the first. This is the first point, and the second point, that is that in fact architecture. I think this idea of promoting equality by design was based itself on a certain sociology. I think that really architecture was part, of this kind of big project. This project that was a project of the engineers, architects, designers of the Werkbund, Bauhaus, etc. This big project of a reshaping of the forms of life, but this big project, in fact, was more or less, based on the idea that But equality was already a kind of characteristic of the social and economic process itself. So the idea, this idea, which was very powerful, I think, in the sociological tradition, that modernity means a kind of automatic kind of homogenization, of the homogenizations of the conditions of life, which means equality. This is why it was possible, for Le Corbusier to do at the same time, so cities for workers, and villas, for capitalists, with the same material, So with the idea that more or less, we are heading toward a certain form of uniformization of conditions, So architecture, I think, or the architectural dream was based on this idea that equality comes by itself, by the very process, of modern life. So in fact, it was in a way the Tocquevillian, presupposition under even, the Marxist, the Marxist theory, that equality is marching. But and of course we know that it was not at all the case,
Yeah.
So that buildings were supposed, to promote equality were based on this idea of an homogenization, and now, of course, those cities, are, just ghettos, for drugs, criminality, and now terrorism. But well, it's not a critique of architecture. But the point is that it is not a question of functionalism or not functionalism. It's really the idea, this kind of double relation, or double play with equality.
Right. Is architecture always a lot of your writing is about the different regimes, art and aesthetics, and it seems that architecture would necessarily always be a product of the dominant regime by virtue of its cost and its complexity. That architecture, do you think architecture, like art is, do you think architecture is possible of being that vehicle that challenges the dominant regime when it's generally the dominant regime that's the producers of architecture?
Well, I think that, well, there has been, historically speaking, a kind of involvement of architecture, in transformations of the form of life in a revolutionary sense, But, well, so it's not only that...
You reference Behrens in some of your books, Behrens to write.
Well, no, Behrens, so it was not, was reference, was interested in Behrens, because, not because he was a champion of equality, obviously he was not, But, well...
What did that building do?
Well, what interests me, yes, is,
for
instance, is, well, the conception even, of this big factory, and this big factory at the same time is a kind of temple of labor, and indicates, even on its facade, but it is not simply architecture, not simply functional, but it is part of a new organization of life. And I think there is something that was shared, in fact, at that moment both by Soviet revolutionaries, and by, German architects, designers who were not revolutionaries, but shared the same idea, I would say, of a kind of culture of use value, opposed to the culture based on exchange value and exploitation. This was, I think, the dream, a certain sociological dream, and also a certain dream, sustaining, underpinning, so
I like
the work of architecture and design.
One of the things I like that I had never understood what you meant by the Behrens part, but the new condition of life, that architecture is somehow complicit in the production of a new condition of life. It reminds me, you've written about Rosa Parks, who had, in a sense, like there's two ways to go about there's many ways to go about social change, but if you imagine for a moment that Rosa Parks had two worlds that she was occupying, one in which she couldn't sit in certain parts of the bus and one in which she could. And I think the critical ambitions of architecture would say, reveal the problems of this world and show that inequalities exist. And I think what you're calling for and what this architecture as a new condition of life is that she said, no, I'm not going to protest this world, I'm just going to live in this world. And she sat in a place where she wasn't allowed to sit. And that was an assumption of equality on her part, an assumption of a new world that she wanted to occupy. And I think the question for many of us is, can architecture fulfill that role? Like, can architecture sit in the different part of the bus and produce the type of world we want to live in?
Well, I think it's quite complicated. It was complicated, but I think I think architects, have to give the answer,
No,
what I can just say, is to propose, perhaps to propose, a kind of idea sustaining the thing itself, Well, I think the point is there is really no reason, no necessity, to reveal inequality,
Yeah.
And the basis of emancipatory thinking and practice, is, well, inequality, it's not something that exists because people don't know about it. Everybody knows about inequality, And the question is not, revealing inequality, and of course, critical art, critical thinking is always revealing inequality, but, no, I think emancipation starts at the moment when it is not revealing inequality, but affirming equality. So making equality live, in the world of inequality. When I was thinking, of, if I have some minutes, it's not architecture at all. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
But I'm thinking, for instance, about the notion of activism. So activism is a new notion. To define, kind of political involvement of artists. And there was an institute of activism that was created in Cuba by Tania Bruguera. And what is fascinating, I think, in her practice, is precisely the way of affirming the existence of what doesn't exist. If you think of his performance, Tatlin's Whisper, which of course also a reference, to the architectural dream. But so the kind of performance instituting free speech in Cuba, and it was first, performed as an artistic performance at the Biennale, Art Biennale in Cuba. And so at the Art Biennale in Cuba, there was a performance of people coming, to institute free speech in Havana, and one of the persons, emits, really the wish, that in the future in Cuba, free speech, will be no more, an artistic performance.
Yeah.
And we know that she tried, to make it exist, and that it was of course, prohibited by the police, But what interests me, is the practice of affirming free speech exists because we exert it, and not simply, we have proved that doesn't exist. There is no way people know that there are no free speech the same way that they know that there is inequality,
Right.
And so and precisely, I think perhaps aesthetics is about this, Aesthetics is not about producing an effect of revelation, because there is all the old artistic practice, which is still, I think, really part of the representative logic, So art producing some kind of effect of awareness, moralization, energy, etc., and or denunciation, revelation, etc., and which is in a way kind of an attempt, even if it is a kind of crazy attempt, to define some kind of some sort of technical and ethical, effect of art at the same time, and of course you can imagine many forms of political art, just destined to prove that there is no free speech in Cuba, And what is I think it becomes an aesthetic affair, when there is not a demonstration of inexistence, but demonstration of existence.
Right. So we have time for, I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll open it up. The last question was about, you've written about disciplinarity quite a bit, and That's something that we of course think quite a bit about here in an architecture school with its own building, with its own discipline, and there's been some discussion on the value of discipline. There's certainly a lot of discussion here. Is there an architectural canon? Should we teach an architectural canon? Should we get rid of the idea of an architectural canon? And I guess the question that might be interesting to hear your answer to is, you talk about the poetics of knowledge, and I wondered how the concept of a discipline is in conflict of a poetics of knowledge, or there's a relationship where one can be transferred into the other. Like, how does one move away from a disciplinary way to transfer knowledge from teacher to student? Or
well, it's a very complicated, issue. I think, really, the point is, that you cannot, the poetics of knowledge is the same thing as, emancipation, It cannot be institutionalized, Yeah. Well, it is always the same thing, there is always this idea that there should be some kind of right way of practicing a discipline, a right way, of the right way of teaching, a right way for organizing, education. But I think no, because in a way, emancipation says there is no right way, There is no point of departure. And what is striking is that so often, many reforms of education that want to be really libertarian, etc., in fact, are still entirely authoritarian, because they say this is the way, things must be organized. This is the real point of departure, and you must not start teaching from this point, but from this point. But no, in a way, I think the poetics of knowledge says, that you can learn from a multiplicity, really of places and through a multiplicity of ways, once, you have abolished, the idea that there is a kind of spatial intelligence. So I think the question of knowledge, in fact, is a twofold question, because behind the idea of knowledge and the idea of discipline, there is not only the idea of how you will transmit knowledge, etc., but there is also a kind of separation, There are those who know and those who don't know, and which means that there are, there are two separate forms of intelligence, and this is called the problem. And in a way, it's impossible. I think, for an institution, to really to be organized in a different way. Of course, no, you can do a lot of different things in an institution to reform it, etc. But emancipation, you cannot emancipate an institution. You cannot emancipate an institution. You cannot really, for instance, gather, professors of philosophy, sociology, etc., law, etc., architecture, fine arts, and tell them, okay, do you think that really, your discipline is a specific form of knowledge, with a specific methodology and specific borders? You cannot do it. You cannot do it because it is their job.
Is that why I knew you? I knew you had the European Graduate School. You were teaching there, and you had written something about their decision to grant degrees. Like, were you hoping that it essentially become more like a university? Like, you were hoping that it would become something different. Is that the reason?
Well, in fact, I was not really so much involved, in the European Graduate School, But, the European Graduate School was a kind of strange institution, some kind of family institution, because it was all led by one person, But we invited, we invited, a lot of so-called, great thinkers, radical thinkers, etc., So there is always a kind of the board is always impressive, And what was interesting is that the students were not ordinary students, but people, involved in different different practices of art, of research, sometimes engineers, and sometimes people doing a lot of different things, and really, so they did not, they came, of course, they came to hear Gage or Badiou or Agamben, that was part, of course, of their interest,
Hilary Sterling.
But at the same time, they were really, in front of you on the basis, of their own research, their own curiosity, and not, with the idea of having, degrees, And so there was a diploma. The diploma was worth nothing. It's always also a problem, to have people pay, for a diploma, but it's worth nothing, and so they decided to create a PhD, and there is a kind of process of normalization, which also affects, the professors. The last time I was supposed to go, so I received, 6 months before, it's a kind of guidelines, all I had to do, for the syllabus and so on, And I called so the director, and said, no, okay, but that's fine, but I don't go. And he said, no, come. That's not. There's no point, But I think that of course he won. No, he could not win. He could not win, and he was defeated. So now I think they have diplomas, but there is still a kind of balance, between people who come just because they are interested, because they are curious person, because they have questions, really, that come from their own practice, and there are many artists. But of course, if they want diplomas, it changes the landscape, because precisely, a school, a university is doing different things at the same time, So giving diplomas is one thing, And there is a kind of presupposition, that really transmitting knowledge or transmitting thinking or thinking, together, this can exactly coincide, with deliverance of a diploma, but that's not true,
Right. The legitimization isn't required. I think we can open up to the audience for a handful of questions. There's some people with microphones that'll hand them to you if you have a question. They just all learned their diplomas are worthless. They don't want to give it a shot anymore.
No, I spoke about the diplomas of the EGS, not your diploma.
Did you just raise your hand? Someone? No.
Yes, I think.
Carolyn.
Thank you so much for your talk. I guess this is in some way carrying through the conversation earlier today, or the conversations earlier today. And I guess I'm really interested in the relationship between activism and disruption, maybe especially in architecture, which I feel like you all have started talking about a little bit. In some way, I want to connect it to this idea of beauty that Elaine brought up, where, say, beauty is something that arrests you in the street and makes you stop and think. And I wonder if that's also connected to what Graham was talking about, where the aesthetic is another type of disruption that separates the object from properties, and then the subject or the beholder kind of steps in. I'm wondering how that might happen in an architectural space, maybe especially if it is, like you were saying, Mark, beholden to a number of power structures and sort of has to be complicit in the whole system of a city, say, in order to exist.
Well, it's hard for me to say what architects, should do. Well, I think that really the problem for architecture is the same, as for any discipline. Well, with the difference, that of course in architecture, you know, there are really issues of money and power, you know, and effect, you know, that are not in other fields, of course. But I really think, you know, that for me, you know, the point is that doing architecture, you know, must mean doing a lot of different things, you know. But you cannot think, you know, that your involvement as activists, for instance, you know, is entirely comprised, you know, in your design, in your way of conceiving design. So I think, in a way, you know, architects are. When they are activists, which also means when they are behaving aesthetically in a way, they do something over. So it is always the question of I would say the side effect, you know, of the effect, you know, in another place, you know. I was thinking here, it's not at all a model, you know, and not at all a model of what architects have to do, you know, but I was thinking here of a group of French architects, you know. They constituted a kind of group of architects, sociologists, photographers, writers, actors, you know. This group was called, you know, the Peru, it means in French, a pole for research about human resources, you know, and basically they were working in the so-called jungle in Calais, which means, you know, the place where migrants stay, you know, while trying, you know, to reach United Kingdom. And what was interesting, you know, in I think their way of proceeding, you know, is that they were not denouncing the situation of the migrants. They were not, you know, helping the migrants, you know, with food, etc. But they were trying to create some kind, I would say, of diagonal, you know, between their knowledge of architecture and their knowledge of form and of beauty and of inhabiting, and the sense of inhabiting which is already present in the camp itself, you know. And so they publish, you know, a lot of photographs, of texts, you know, to prove, you know, that there is always aesthetic, there is always a sense of form, you know, in the makeshift cabins, you know, of the migrants, you know, and after was a kind of extension, you know, of their project, because they decided to create some kind of utopian project in a way, but at the same time the utopian project was a kind of exact calculus, you know, of the cost, you know, and they proved that, you know, it was less expensive, you know, rather than destroying the camp, you know, to reconstruct, you know, the town itself, Calais, you know, the town, so near the camp, you know, as a kind of new city, you know. So there was this plan of a word of Calais becoming a world city, you know, instead of being, you know, a petit bourgeois city, you know, near a migrant camp, you know. And of course, you know, the authority is here, you know, to prevent it, you know, from being done. But what's interesting is always this application of the method, you know, of making exist what cannot exist, you know, or proving the existence what is not supposed to exist, you know. And so there was a kind of interesting combination of strategy, you know, of strategy of reshaping, you know, the life with a kind of critical strategy, because they had the whole strategy. Not only did they construct, you know, this plan of the future city, but also, you know, they published it in a fake magazine of the town, you know, with a fake letter of the mayor, you know, and a fake interview of the French president, you know, about the future. So I think for me, you know, it's an interesting development. And of course, I don't think that is what architecture in general has to do, you know. But what I just mean, you know, that architecture must, or architects, not architecture in general, but it doesn't exist. But of course, architects, you know, probably are to today, you know, people who can act, you know, at different levels, you know, in different fields, you know. So, trying to rethink the common word, because rethinking a common word precisely, involves multiplicities, of activities of very different kinds.
Peggy?
I'm maybe going to continue on the last question or push it in another direction, but it does seem to me that in the main talks that we've had, from Elaine Scarry to Triple O, Tim Horton and Graham Harmon and yourself, that there are very different definitions of aesthetics. And in some way, Elaine Scarry's really does revolve around beauty, and the Triple O around the charisma of the object, and yours around a sensibility that pre-exists its capture by aesthetic, but not aesthetic regimes, but political regimes. But is behind that, it seems to me that what is really different, because maybe those aren't so different, and I guess that's partly what I want to ask about, maybe they're really more similar than I'm now thinking, but is a difference between the notion of this subject, and it does seem to me that in Elaine Scarry's and in object-oriented ontology, there is a sense of I'm going to trip myself up here, but there is a private, personal relationship with the object. The aesthetic dimension is described by what the subject and the object do in a direct way, but it's indirect with object-oriented ontology. But with you, the subject is a socialized subject. You can't divorce that subject from a socio-economico-political context, that pure subject can't have any direct relationship with an object. That would be an absurd way to think about it. But am I getting this right in any way? Either my characterization of the subject or the differences in aesthetics that we're seeing here?
Probably my point of view, of course, you cannot. I'm not interested, in the relation between a subject and an object. This doesn't mean that I don't like, to be in front, of beautiful things. I was at the museum yesterday. I enjoyed, a lot of things. That's not the point. I was speaking of the aesthetic relation, as a kind of also specific relation, which is not a relation to an object, but rather, a position, inside a set of relations, and it is what was, reminded by Mark, about the joiner, Goni, in his at his work, and looking for the window, taking a kind of aesthetic possession, of the landscape, dissociating his gaze from the work of his hands, which means that being a subject, means, in a way, adopting a certain position, in the distribution of occupation, a distribution which is both material and symbolical, and so and also, I think what is important for me is that there is no opposition, between the individual subject and the collective subject, in a way it is the same problem, I think there is a kind of aesthetic constitution of a group when there is a kind of disruption, of a space, by people gathering in a place, but for me really, being a subject means, operating, a certain redistribution, of the coordinates of experience, So
Okay. I think you probably need to continue questions upstairs with some drinks in honor of Professor Rancière. And thank you so much.
Just before you leave, let me say a few things, and the people in the other rooms as well. First of all, Mark, thank you very much, and Professor Rancière, thank you for your impassioned presentation. Much appreciated. I also want to thank everybody who presented today. There was a lot of information and a lot of passion in those presentations as well. This symposium will continue tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. There are 3 presentations and discussions over the course of the day tomorrow: the aesthetics of activism, the aesthetics of the progressive, and the aesthetics of the other. I look forward to you joining us. If you were here last night, or if you are part of the Yale architecture community, you know we extend our hospitality. We will be having a reception upstairs again this evening. There are a lot of people, so I welcome you all, and I appreciate in advance your patience and our crowding. In honor of our visiting Frenchmen, tonight's drink is called the French 75. It's true, it's real, it's all real. It's an object. No. It was invented in Paris just after World War I. It is named after a famous French 75-millimeter field gun, which was actually used in the war, about which its kick, that is the kick of the cocktail, was said to be equal to that of the gun. It contains gin, sugar, champagne, and a lemon twist, and although first created in Paris, the drink gained popularity precisely for its exotic foreignness at the Stork Club in New York. So we'll see you upstairs.